Welcome to Void of Fears, where the line between reality and nightmares blur with every tale. What you're about to hear has happened to someone, somewhere, perhaps even someone just like you. Our community continues to grow, and now we're reaching for 100,000 subscribers. If these glimpses into the unknown call to you, please consider subscribing. Now let's dive into tonight's story. The call came at 3:47 in the morning, jolting Dr. Marcus Kane from a restless sleep in his cramped quarters at the Anchorage Research Facility. The voice on the other end belonged to Director Patricia Hendricks, and her tone carried an urgency that made Kane's blood run cold. "Marcus, we need you suited up and ready to move in 2 hours. The deep ice radar array picked up something beneath the Beaufort Sea that defies explanation." Kane rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the fog of interrupted sleep. His small room was spartanly furnished, walls lined with photographs from previous expeditions and archaeological discoveries that had made his reputation. Outside his window, the Alaska darkness stretched endlessly, broken only by the distant glow of the research facility's floodlights. "What kind of something?" Kane asked, already swinging his legs out of bed. After 3 years working with NASA's experimental Deep Ice Division, he'd learned that middle-of-the-night calls usually meant something extraordinary had been discovered. Metallic structures, massive ones, buried 2.7 miles beneath the ice sheet. "The preliminary scan suggests they're submarines, Marcus. Dozens of them." The archaeologist sat up straighter, his mind racing. "That's impossible. The ice in that region has been solid for millennia. Nothing that large could have sunk that deep without leaving geological evidence, without disrupting the ice formation patterns we've been studying for decades. Without leaving a trace on our geological surveys, yes. That's why we need you down there. Your expertise in underwater archaeology and preservation techniques could be the key to understanding what we're looking at. Pack for extended cold weather operations. The Prometheus launches at dawn." Kane had worked with Director Hendricks on 17 previous expeditions, but he had never heard her sound this shaken. Her voice carried an undertone of fear that was completely unlike her usual professional composure. As he gathered his equipment in the pre-dawn darkness, one thought kept circling through his mind. How do submarines end up buried under ice that's been frozen solid since before recorded history? The specialized gear took him 40 minutes to assemble. His archaeological kit included ground-penetrating radar units, preservation chemicals, digital documentation equipment, and sample containers designed to maintain the integrity of organic materials in extreme cold. His personal survival gear was equally comprehensive. Thermal suits rated for temperatures down to -80 degrees, emergency oxygen supplies, heated battery packs, and communication equipment designed to function in the electromagnetic interference, common in deep Arctic conditions. Kane's mind wandered to his last conversation with his sister Emma, a conversation that now seemed prophetic. She'd expressed concern about his increasingly dangerous expeditions, his willingness to venture into places where others feared to go. "One day you're going to find something that shouldn't be found," she'd said over dinner just 2 weeks ago. "Some discoveries are meant to stay buried." The flight to the drilling site took 4 hours, during which Kane reviewed the preliminary radar data on his tablet. The images showed dark, elongated shapes arranged in what appeared to be deliberate formations beneath the ice. Some of the signatures matched the dimensions of known submarine classes, the distinctive profile of German U-boats, the larger bulk of Soviet nuclear submarines, the sleek lines of modern attack vessels, but others were completely unfamiliar, showing proportions and configurations that didn't match anything in his extensive database of maritime vessels. Most disturbing was the depth reading, 2.7 miles straight down through solid ice. Kane ran calculations in his head, trying to understand the physics involved. Even if these submarines had somehow been deposited on the surface centuries ago, The annual accumulation of ice in this region would have buried them gradually over time, but the depth suggested they'd been placed there when the ice was much thinner, or somehow pulled down through solid frozen water in a way that violated everything he knew about material science. The helicopter carrying Kane flew over endless stretches of white wilderness, broken only by the occasional research station or weather monitoring post. Below them, the Arctic Ocean lay hidden beneath miles of ice that had accumulated over millennia. Kane pressed his face to the window, watching the landscape scroll past, trying to imagine what forces could have created the anomaly they were investigating. Captain Rebecca Torres greeted Kane at the landing site with a grim handshake. Torres had spent 15 years running polar expeditions, and her weathered face spoke of countless battles with the Arctic's fury. Her reputation in the scientific community was legendary. She'd led successful missions to some of the most inhospitable places on Earth, bringing her teams back alive from situations that had claimed other expedition leaders. "The readings get stranger the more we analyze them," Torres said, leading Kane towards the massive drilling platform that dominated the temporary base camp. Some of these signatures matched German U-boats from World War II, submarines that, according to our records, were destroyed in completely different locations. Others look like Soviet nuclear submarines that shouldn't exist in these waters, according to any historical documentation we can find. And then there are the ones that don't match anything in our databases. The base camp itself was a marvel of engineering efficiency. Prefabricated structures had been assembled around the drilling site, creating a small community of scientists, engineers, and support personnel. Generators hummed continuously, providing power for the sophisticated equipment that would guide their descent. The air was filled with the constant sound of machinery, the hiss of heating systems, and the crackle of radio communications. Behind Torres stood Dr. James Whitmore, the chief engineer whose thermal drilling expertise had made the Prometheus project possible. Whitmore was a thin, intense man in his 50s, with prematurely grey hair and eyes that seemed to analyse everything with engineering precision. His reputation for solving supposedly impossible technical challenges had made him indispensable to NASA's most ambitious projects. "Dr. Kane," Whitmore said, extending a hand. "I've read your papers on deep-sea preservation. Your work on the Titanic expedition was particularly insightful. We're going to need that expertise down there." The Prometheus itself was a marvel of engineering, a self-contained drilling platform capable of melting through ice at unprecedented depths while maintaining a stable descent chamber for human occupants. The machine stood 3 stories tall, its thermal lance extending downward like a massive spear designed to pierce the heart of the Arctic ice. Cooling systems, power generators, and life support equipment were integrated into a design that looked more like a spacecraft than conventional drilling equipment. "The thermal lance can maintain a shaft diameter of 12 feet while descending," Whitmore explained as they toured the equipment. "The heated walls prevent refreezing for approximately 6 hours after passage, giving us a window for emergency ascent, if necessary. The descent chamber is pressurized and heated, with enough oxygen for a crew of 4 to survive for up to 24 hours in emergency conditions." Kane examined the viewing ports, reinforced transparent aluminum designed to withstand the immense pressure of deep ice operations. "What's our contingency if something goes wrong down there? What if the thermal lance encounters an obstruction we can't penetrate?" Torres and Whitmore exchanged a look that didn't inspire confidence. Kane had seen that expression before, on the faces of expedition leaders who were venturing into territory beyond their experience or control. "The emergency ascent system can get us back to the surface in 20 minutes, Torres said carefully, assuming nothing interferes with the shaft integrity. "We have redundant power systems, emergency heating, and enough supplies to survive for several days if we become trapped." "But," Whitmore added, "once we reach the bottom, we're committed. The ice will begin refreezing behind us within hours of our passage, if the thermal lance fails during ascent, will be permanently sealed beneath the ice. Kane nodded, though a knot of anxiety was forming in his stomach. He'd participated in dangerous expeditions before, but something about this mission felt different. The secrecy surrounding the discovery, the unprecedented depth of the target, and the inexplicable nature of the radar signatures all combined to create an atmosphere of foreboding that seemed to affect everyone at the base camp. The descent began at 8:15 a.m., the Prometheus platform lowering itself into the shaft created by the thermal lance. Kane, Torres, and Whitmore were joined by Dr. Lisa Park, a geologist whose expertise in ice formation would help them understand the layers they encountered during the descent. Park was a compact, energetic woman in her 30s, with an enthusiasm for Arctic geology that bordered on obsession. Through the reinforced viewing ports, Kane watched layers of ice slide past in a hypnotic display of geological time. The first 1,000 feet revealed the expected annual accumulation layers, each one marking another year of Arctic winter. Park provided commentary as they descended, explaining the subtle variations in ice density and composition that told stories of ancient weather patterns and atmospheric conditions. "This layer here," Park said, pointing to a band of slightly darker ice, probably corresponds to the volcanic winter of 1815, when Mount Tambora's eruption darkened skies worldwide. The ice shows elevated sulfur content and atmospheric particulates from that event. But as they descended deeper, the ice began to change in ways that Park couldn't explain. Dark striations appeared, threading through the frozen layers like veins of some unknown material. The regular patterns of annual accumulation became distorted, as if something had disturbed the natural process of ice formation. "This is unusual," Park muttered, taking readings with her instruments. "The ice structure suggests periods of rapid melting and refreezing, but the geological record doesn't support that kind of thermal activity in this region." When Whitmore took a core sample at the 4,000 foot mark using the platform's extraction equipment, the sample contained something that made Kane's breath catch in his throat. The extracted ice was shot through with dark, fibrous material that looked almost organic in nature. "Are those organic fibers?" Kane asked, examining the dark threads embedded in the ice. Under magnification, the material appeared to have a cellular structure, but unlike anything in his database of known organic compounds. Whitmore held the sample up to the light, his expression troubled. "They appear to be organic, but the preservation is unlike anything I've seen. The cellular structure is intact, which suggests rapid freezing under extreme pressure, but the geological evidence doesn't support that kind of event in this region, not at this depth and age." Kane took photographs of the sample from multiple angles, noting that the organic material seemed to form patterns within the ice, almost like a network of connections spreading through the frozen depths. The fibers were distributed throughout the sample, but they weren't random. They formed branching patterns that reminded Kane of neural networks or root systems. As they continued downward, the organic material became more prevalent. By the time they reached 8,000 feet, entire sections of ice were shot through with a dark, fibrous matter. Kane collected multiple samples, noting that the material seemed to increase in density as they descended, as if they were approaching its source. "The organic content is increasing exponentially," Park reported, her voice tight with concern. "At this rate, the lower levels of ice might be more organic than frozen water. I've never seen anything like this in polar ice formations." The temperature readings were also anomalous. Despite being miles beneath the surface, the ice was warmer than expected, suggesting an internal heat source that current geological models couldn't explain. Whitmore's instruments detected faint electromagnetic activity, barely perceptible but definitely present. "There's something down there generating both heat and electromagnetic fields," Whitmore said, studying his readouts. The patterns are too regular to be natural geological activity. At 10,000 feet, they encountered their first major obstruction. The thermal lance suddenly began consuming power at an alarming rate, struggling against ice that seemed unnaturally resistant to melting. The organic fibers were now so dense that the ice looked more like frozen tissue than frozen water. Power consumption is through the roof, Whitmore reported, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. Whatever this material is, it has thermal properties unlike normal ice. The lance is having to work 3 times harder to maintain penetration. Kane pressed against the viewing port, studying the ice formations around them. The organic material wasn't just embedded in the ice anymore. It seemed to be actively growing through it, creating complex 3-dimensional structures that pulsed faintly with bioluminescent light. "It's alive," Kane whispered, then louder. "This material is alive. We're not just drilling through ice, we're drilling through some kind of massive organism." Torres leaned over his shoulder, following his gaze. "That's impossible. Nothing could survive at these depths, at these temperatures, for the length of time required to create these formations. Unless," Park said slowly, "unless it's not from our time period. What if this organism existed when the climate was different, when this region was warmer? What if it was flash frozen during some catastrophic climate event and has been preserved ever since?" Kane's mind raced with the implications. If Park was right, they weren't just exploring a geological anomaly. They were potentially making contact with a prehistoric ecosystem, a form of life that predated human civilization by millions of years. "Depth reading 12,000 feet, Torres announced. "Core temperature of the surrounding ice is minus 20 degrees Celsius, but my instruments are detecting heat signatures below us. Something down there is generating warmth." The organic material around them was now clearly alive, pulsing with slow, rhythmic movements that reminded Kane of breathing or circulation. Bioluminescent patterns flowed through the fibrous networks, creating an eerie light show in the depths around their descent chamber. At 13,500 feet, the thermal lance encountered something that made the entire platform shudder. Whitmore's instruments showed massive power drain as the lance struggled against an obstruction harder than the surrounding ice. "We're hitting something metallic," Whitmore reported, his voice tight with concentration. "Large metallic objects embedded in the organic ice matrix." Kane felt his heart rate increase. They were approaching the target depth, the location where the radar had detected the submarine signatures. But now, surrounded by living organic material that pulsed with alien life, the discovery took on a more sinister significance. "Depth reading 14,000 feet, Torres announced. "We should be approaching the target zone." The thermal lance suddenly encountered massive resistance, then without warning, broke through into open space. The sudden change in pressure made their ears pop, and emergency systems activated throughout the platform. "We've got a cavity," Whitmore reported, checking his instruments frantically. "Large one. The thermal readings suggest we've entered a chamber approximately 200 feet high and over half a mile across, but that's not possible at this depth." Kane felt his heart hammering as the Prometheus platform lowered into the cavern. Emergency lighting activated automatically, casting harsh beams through the darkness below. The organic material they'd been descending through formed a ceiling above them, pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that provided an eerie backdrop to their artificial lights. What those lights revealed defied everything Kane thought he knew about Arctic geology, about physics, about the possible. Submarines, dozens of them, arranged throughout the cavern, like exhibits in some nightmarish museum. The vessels sat partially embedded in the ice floor, their hulls gleaming under the artificial lights as if they'd been placed there yesterday. But these weren't random wrecks or archaeological discoveries. They were arranged in precise patterns, organized by size and era, in a display that suggested deliberate curation. "My God," Torres whispered over the comm system. "Look at the variety. Look at the organization." Kane pressed against the viewing port, his archaeological training automatically cataloguing what he saw. A German U-boat, its hull marked with the distinctive wolf's head emblem of a World War II wolf pack, sat in perfect condition as if it had been preserved in a museum. Next to it, a Soviet nuclear submarine, its conning tower bearing Cyrillic letters that identified it as belonging to the Northern Fleet. Beyond that, vessels Kane didn't recognize. Sleek, angular designs that looked decades ahead of current technology. But it was the arrangement that truly disturbed him. The submarines weren't scattered randomly, as wreckage would be. They were positioned in concentric circles around a central depression in the cavern floor, like offerings arranged around an altar. The pattern was too deliberate, too purposeful to be the result of natural forces. "Captain," Whitmore's voice was tight with concern, "some of these readings don't make sense. That submarine there, the one with the unusual hull configuration, my instruments are telling me it's made from materials that don't exist in our periodic table, and the one beyond it appears to be constructed from alloys that won't be developed for another 20 years. Torres guided the Prometheus to a landing platform that extended from the main drill housing. "We're going to need to investigate on foot. Kane, you're our expert on historical preservation and underwater archaeology. What's your assessment?" Kane was already suiting up in his exploration gear, his hands shaking slightly as he sealed the thermal suit. "The preservation is perfect. Too perfect. Ice this old should have caused structural damage to any metal objects through thermal expansion and contraction cycles, but these vessels look like they were frozen yesterday." The cavern's atmosphere was breathable but intensely cold, requiring full environmental suits for exploration. They established an exploration perimeter, setting up portable heaters and communication relays that would maintain contact with the surface. The organic material that formed the cavern's ceiling pulsed overhead, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow that made everything feel alive and watching. Kane approached the nearest submarine, a World War II era vessel that his portable database identified as U-534, a German U-boat that had supposedly been sunk in the North Sea in 1945. But according to his records, U-534 had been raised from the ocean floor and was currently on display in a museum in England. "This is impossible," he muttered, running his gloved hand along the hull. The metal was cold but not brittle, showing no signs of the corrosion or structural damage that should have resulted from decades of exposure to ice and pressure. U-534 was raised in 1993 and is on display at the Woodside Ferry Terminal. How can it be here? Torres joined him at the submarine's conning tower, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The hatch was sealed, but not locked, and the wheel turned easily when Torres applied pressure. "Should we attempt entry?" Kane nodded, though every instinct screamed against it. Something about the perfect preservation, the deliberate arrangement, and the organic ceiling that pulsed overhead suggested they were walking into a trap that had been set long before they were born. They managed to open the hatch, revealing a ladder that descended into the submarine's interior. The moment Kane's flashlight beam penetrated the darkness below, he wished they'd never found this place, wished they'd never answered the call that brought them here. The crew was still at their stations, perfectly preserved in the frigid air. German sailors sat frozen at their controls, but their preservation was horrifyingly unnatural. Their faces were locked in expressions of absolute terror, eyes wide with horror, mouths open in silent screams that had been cut short decades ago. Some had their hands raised defensively, as if trying to shield themselves from something that had approached from the forward compartments. But most disturbing was their positioning. The crew members weren't slumped over their stations as death would naturally leave them. They were arranged, positioned deliberately to face towards the rear of the submarine, as if something had turned them to watch its approach. Their terror was deliberate, curated, preserved for some incomprehensible purpose. "Jesus Christ," Torres breathed, her flashlight beam joining Kane's to illuminate the macabre scene. What could have frightened them like this? What could have arranged them in these positions? Kane moved carefully through the submarine's narrow corridors, documenting everything with his camera, while fighting down waves of nausea. The preservation was so perfect that the crew looked like they might resume their duties at any moment, if not for the expressions of absolute horror frozen on their faces. In the radio room, Kane found evidence of the crew's final moments. Equipment was torn apart, not by explosion or collision, but by desperate hands trying to send final messages. Morse code keys had been hammered until they broke. Radio equipment smashed in frustration when no signals could get through the ice above. But it was in the captain's quarters that Kane found the ship's log, still open to the final entry. The handwriting started neat and professional, but devolved into desperate scrawl as the entry progressed. The 15th of November, 1944. Position unknown, depth unknown. Something has taken hold of our vessel during the night. The ice above us moves like water, pulling us down into depths that should not exist. The water around us glows with unnatural light, and we can see shapes moving beneath us, vast and purposeful. The men report hearing voices through the hull, speaking in languages that hurt to comprehend. God help us, it's not natural. It's not of this world. The thing below us, it's intelligent. It's been waiting. Webber swears he saw faces in the ice, faces of other crews, other ships. The shepherd comes. The shepherd comes for us all. It collects us, arranges us, preserves our fear for purposes we cannot understand. We are not the first, and we will not be the last. Kane read the entry aloud over the comm system, his voice echoing strangely in the submarine's cramped quarters. "The shepherd? What do you think that means?" "I don't know," Torres replied from the control room, "but we should check the other vessels. If they all contain similar logs, we might be able to piece together what happened here." They spent the next 3 hours exploring the submarine graveyard, and what they found painted a picture of systematic collection spanning not just decades, but centuries. A Soviet submarine from 1962 contained similar entries about being dragged beneath the ice by an unseen force that the crew called the Collector. The final log entry described crew members being arranged in positions of terror while still alive, forced to watch as something incomprehensible studied them before preserving them forever. A British submarine from 1982 held logs describing encounters with an intelligence that seemed to exist partially outside normal space and time. The crew reported seeing other submarines in the ice around them, vessels from different eras, all collected in the same impossible location. Their final entries spoke of understanding that they were being added to a collection. Specimens in a museum curated by something that found human terror fascinating, but it was in the most advanced submarine, one that Kane's database couldn't identify at all, that they found the most disturbing information. The vessel appeared to be constructed from materials that wouldn't be invented for decades, powered by energy sources that current science couldn't explain. Its computer systems were still partially functional, running on some form of power that Whitmore's instruments couldn't identify. When Kane accessed the ship's records, he discovered logs that dated forward in time. The entries were dated 5, 10, even 20 years in the future, describing missions to investigate disappearances in the Arctic Ocean that hadn't happened yet. "This entry is dated 5 years from now," Kane said, his voice hollow as he read from the submarine's computer screen. "It describes a mission to investigate the disappearance of multiple research teams in this region. The crew reports finding a cavern filled with submarines from different time periods, all arranged by an entity they call the Shepherd." The final log entry from the future submarine was the most chilling. "Day unknown, time has no meaning here. The Shepherd exists outside temporal flow, collecting vessels and crews from across history. We understand now that we've always been here. We'll always be here. The collection is eternal, and we are part of it. Every team that discovers this place becomes part of the discovery process for the next team. We are trapped in a loop of terror and preservation, and there is no escape. Torres checked her instruments, noting anomalous readings from throughout the cavern. Marcus, we need to consider the possibility that we're not just looking at a graveyard. We might be looking at an active collection, and we might be the next specimens. As if summoned by her words, a low vibration began to resonate through the cavern. The ice beneath their feet trembled, and somewhere in the darkness beyond their lights, something massive began to move. The organic ceiling above them pulsed with increased activity, bioluminescent patterns flowing faster through the fibrous networks. "Equipment malfunction," Whitmore reported, his voice tight with alarm. "The thermal lance is showing massive power drains. Something's interfering with our systems on a fundamental level. The electromagnetic readings are off the charts." The vibration grew stronger, accompanied by a sound like grinding metal mixed with organic breathing. Through the cavern floor, visible through the clear ice that formed the bottom of the chamber, shapes began to emerge, vast, undulating forms that seemed part machine, part living tissue, reaching up towards the collected submarines with appendages that defied description. "It's been dormant," Kane realized, backing towards the Prometheus platform while his mind reeled with the implications. Our drilling, our thermal lance, the electromagnetic activity from our equipment, it woke something up. Something that's been sleeping beneath the collection. The ice around them began to crack and shift with increasing violence. Through the growing fissures, they could see more of the entity below. A massive intelligence that seemed to exist partially in their dimension and partially elsewhere, using the collected vessels as anchors to reality. The submarines weren't just preserved specimens, they were components in some incomprehensible mechanism that allowed the entity to interact with the physical world. "Emergency ascent, now!" Torres shouted, but Whitmore was already shaking his head, his face pale with terror and technical understanding. "The shaft is compromised. Something's interfering with the thermal systems. On a molecular level, the ice is refreezing faster than our heating elements can compensate. We're not going anywhere." Kane watched in horror as tendrils of the entity began emerging through the cracks in the ice, reaching toward their platform with obvious intent. The appendages were part organic tissue, part metallic mechanism, part something else that his mind refused to process. Through his comm system, he could hear mechanical sounds echoing from the collected submarines. The grinding of metal being bent and shaped, the hiss of air being expelled from sealed chambers, the sound of preservation systems activating. "It's not just collecting the submarines," Kane said, understanding flooding through him with terrible clarity. "It's collecting the crews, their knowledge, their experiences, their terror. Every vessel is a data point in some vast experiment or collection. The fear of the crews isn't a byproduct, it's the purpose." The entity's influence was spreading throughout the cavern. Kane could see the collected submarines beginning to glow with internal light, their preserved crews moving slightly, as if the entity was accessing their stored experiences, reliving their final moments of terror over and over again. Torres was already on the radio, transmitting their final report to the surface through the static and interference. "Base camp, this is Torres. We've made contact with an entity beneath the ice. It appears to be responsible for the submarine disappearances spanning multiple decades. Our position is compromised. Repeat, our position is compromised and we require immediate evacuation." Static filled the comm channel, then cleared to reveal Director Hendrick's voice, distorted by distance and electromagnetic interference. "Torres, your transmission is breaking up. What's your status? We're reading massive seismic activity in your area." Kane grabbed the radio, knowing this might be their last chance to warn the surface team. "Director, you need to seal this site immediately. Whatever you do, don't send another team down here. The entity collects submarines and their crews for purposes we can't comprehend. It exists partially outside normal time and space. We're going to become part of its collection. Through the cavern, the sound of metal being twisted and reshaped grew louder. Kane could see their own platform beginning to shift, as invisible forces took hold of it, bending the reinforced supports like soft metal. Around them, the collected submarines seemed to pulse with a faint light, as if the entity was awakening its entire collection to witness the addition of new specimens. "Marcus," Torres said quietly, pointing toward the center of the spiral arrangement. "Look at the pattern. Look what's happening at the center." Kane followed her gaze and saw what she meant. The submarines weren't just randomly arranged in circles. They formed a complex spiral pattern around a central depression in the cavern floor, like offerings arranged around an altar. And at the center of that spiral, something was rising through the ice with deliberate, purposeful movement. The thing that emerged was beyond Kane's ability to fully comprehend. It was part organic creature, part mechanical construct, part something else that existed in dimensions his mind couldn't process. It stood perhaps 50 feet tall, with appendages that shifted between tentacles, mechanical arms, and structures that seemed to phase in and out of visible reality. "It's a museum," Kane whispered, understanding dawning with horrible clarity, "or a feeding ground. It preserves the crews in their moment of greatest terror, feeding on their fear while studying their technology, their culture, their knowledge. We're specimens, and our terror is the preservation medium." The radio crackled back to life, Director Hendrick's voice barely penetrable through the static. "All teams, this is base camp. We're reading massive seismic activity in your area. Emergency extraction protocols are in effect. We're sending down additional thermal lances to widen the shaft for emergency evacuation." Kane laughed, but there was no humor in it. Only the sound of a mind beginning to fracture under impossible pressure. "There won't be an extraction, Director. We're already part of the collection. We always have been." As the entity's appendages wrapped around the Prometheus platform with gentleness that was somehow more terrifying than violence, Kane realized the full scope of the terrible truth. The advanced submarines, the ones with future technology and logs dated years ahead, weren't predictions or temporal anomalies. They were previous iterations of this same scenario, teams that had discovered the graveyard and become part of it, their vessels somehow displaced in time by the entity's incomprehensible abilities. The entity existed outside normal temporal flow, experiencing all moments simultaneously. Every team that discovered the collection became part of the collection, but also became part of the process that led to their own discovery. The future logs weren't prophecies. They were memories of events that had already happened from the entity's perspective. "The logs we found," Kane said, his voice barely a whisper as the platform began to sink into the ice while the entity's preservation systems activated around them. "They weren't from other expeditions. They were from us. We've been here before. We'll be here again. Time doesn't work the same way down here." Torres looked at him with growing horror as the implications sank in. "What are you saying?" "Time doesn't work the same way down here. The entity exists outside normal temporal flow, experiencing past, present, and future simultaneously. Every team that discovers this place becomes part of its collection, but also becomes part of the discovery process for the next team. We're trapped in a loop, and we always have been." The preservation process was beginning around them. Kane could feel his thoughts slowing, his terror crystallizing into something permanent that the entity could access and experience repeatedly. Through the platform's viewing ports, he could see the other submarines, their crews still perfectly preserved in their moments of ultimate fear, and he understood that he was about to join them in an eternity of curated horror. The ice closed over the Prometheus platform as Kane made his final transmission, his voice already beginning to take on the hollow quality of the preserved dead. "Base camp, this is Dr. Marcus Kane. Final report. The entity beneath the ice collects vessels and crews for purposes we cannot comprehend. It exists outside normal time, experiencing all moments simultaneously. It preserves specimens in a state of perpetual terror, feeding on their fear, while studying their knowledge and experiences. Do not attempt rescue. Do not send additional teams. Seal this site and forget it exists. The Shepherd has claimed us, just as it claimed all the others, just as it will claim whoever comes looking for us. Static filled the comm channel. Then silence that seemed to echo through dimensions beyond the physical cavern. The entity's preservation systems completed their work, adding another submarine and crew to the spiral arrangement that had been growing for centuries, maybe millennia. The Prometheus platform took its place among the collection, its crew frozen in their final moments of understanding and terror, perfectly preserved for the entity's ongoing study of human fear and knowledge. Above them, the organic ceiling pulsed with satisfaction, bioluminescent patterns flowing in complex sequences that might have been the entity's equivalent of contentment. The collection was complete, for now, but it was never truly complete. The entity existed outside time, and it knew that more specimens would come. They always came. They always had come. They always would come. 50 years later, just as the entity knew they would, advanced ground-penetrating radar detected massive metallic structures buried 2.7 miles beneath the Arctic ice sheet. The readings were impossible. Submarines from different eras, arranged in patterns that defied explanation. Some appeared to be vessels that had been lost decades ago, while others seemed to incorporate technology that wouldn't be developed for years to come. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a marine archaeologist working with NASA's Deep Ice Exploration team, received an urgent call at her research facility in Anchorage. The voice on the other end belonged to Director Harrison Webb, and his tone carried an urgency that made her blood run cold. "Elena, we need you suited up and ready to move in 2 hours. The deep ice radar array picked up something beneath the Beaufort Sea that defies explanation." Elena rubbed her eyes, trying to shake off the fog of interrupted sleep. What kind of something? Metallic structures, massive ones, buried 2.7 miles beneath the ice sheet. The preliminary scans suggest they're submarines, Elena. Dozens of them. The cycle continued, as it always had, as it always would, in the frozen depths where time held no meaning, and terror was perfectly preserved for an intelligence that collected human knowledge, one submarine at a time. The entity waited patiently, existing in all moments simultaneously, knowing that discovery was inevitable, that preservation was eternal, and that the collection would continue to grow throughout past, present, and future, forever and always without end.